Howdy, literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. This week is the week of September 11th, so I thought I would read a book about the events of September 11th. I found this book last spring, but saved it until fall. It's 102 Minutes, The Untold Story of the Fight to Survive Inside the Twin Towers by Jim Dwyer and Kevin Flynn. This is probably the 10th book or so I've read about September 11th. 102 Minutes was unlike all the rest in what I learned. It was published in 2005, just 4 years after it happened, yet the research is thorough and stunning. And as a side note, this is the second 9/11 book that I bought used that had plane tickets inside it. A book about 9/11 would be the last thing I would want to read while flying. So, in case you might need a refresher on what happened on September 11th, because it did happen 23 years ago, which makes me feel really old when I say that. I was just out of college when it happened, so I remember it well. I saw it all unfold on TV after the first plane hit the World Trade Center, like so many others. While the internet was certainly a thing in 2001, news stations were still the predominant medium through which we received the news. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 flew into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At 9:02, a second airline, United Airlines Flight 175, flew into the South Tower. At 9:58, the South Tower collapsed. Then at 10:28, the North Tower collapsed, thus giving us 102 minutes. Elsewhere in the country, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 flew into the Pentagon, killing 58 passengers and crew, plus 125 people on the ground. A fourth hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed in a Pennsylvania field when the passengers took it over, killing all 44 passengers and crew on board. 102 Minutes focuses solely on what unfolded in the Twin Towers. First off, if you are young and don't know much about September 11th, I would highly encourage you to watch the video on YouTube called September 11th as It Happened, the definitive live news montage, simply because this is how history unfolds. We have no idea what is actually happening when it's happening, yet we understand the horror, maybe more so when tragic events aren't reduced to a couple paragraphs in an article or a history textbook. I show that video to my juvenile detention students every school year. I also have the graphic novel as well as other books for them, but this book, the 9/11 Report, lays out the details of what happened. Okay, I promise the rest of what I talk about will focus on 102 minutes. The best way to unpack what is within 102 minutes is to read to you 3 paragraphs from the author's note at the beginning of the book. This is essential, for it shows what the authors uncovered as they gathered evidence, research, and interviews from survivors and loved ones' last conversations with those who didn't survive. 102 Minutes is not just about the terrorist attacks, but much more that happened long before September 11th. And there's more than one thinks that went on before. Nothing can diminish the culpability of the hijackers and their masters in the murders of September 11, 2001, which stand beyond mitigation as the defining historical truth of the day. The ferocity of the attacks meant that innocent people lived or died because they stepped back from a doorway or hopped onto a closing elevator or simply shifted their weight from one foot to another. That said, simply to declare that the hijackers alone killed all those people gives them far more credit as tacticians than they are due. The buildings themselves became weapons, apparently well beyond the designs of the hijackers, if not their hopes. So too did a sclerotic emergency response culture in New York that resisted reform, even when confronted again and again with the dangers of business as usual. At least 1,500 people in the Trade Center, and possibly many more, survived the initial crashes, but died because they were unable to escape from their floors or elevators while the buildings stood. Those people were not killed by the planes alone any more than passengers on the Titanic were killed by the iceberg. With 102 minutes in the North Tower and 57 minutes in the South, thousands of people had time to evacuate and did. Those who did not escape were trapped by circumstances that had been the subject of debates that began before the first shovelful of earth was turned for the Trade Center. And that continued at a low volume through the entire existence of the towers. Could the buildings withstand the direct impact of an airplane? Was the fireproofing adequate? Were there thorough exits? The willingness of firefighters, police officers, and medical workers to serve others, never in question, was indelibly established on September 11th. Stark and towering as their sacrifices are, they do not stand alone in history. We have now obtained many records documenting the emergency response that both the City of New York and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey have tried to keep secret. These records show that for all the aggressiveness of the response, emergency workers suffered the same failures of communication, coordination, and command that they had experienced on February 26, 1993, when terrorists first tried to knock down the Trade Center. This time, those failures came at terrible cost. Indeed, for 102 minutes, success and failure, life and death, ran parallel courses, as did effort and selflessness, infighting, and short-sightedness. The book delivered on all that was just stated there. First of all, let me state that the book was difficult to get through, not from any readability standpoint, but more so of the content. I don't know if getting older has really brought forth my own mortality or what, but I had to put the book down several times, even though I was desperate to keep reading to find out how each survivor made it out of the building. And there were some unbelievable stories of escape and of help from other office workers that I had never read before in any other article or book. Just incredible stories. I also found myself yelling at the book. In all the confusion, so many people were told not to evacuate. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Even though I've read so much about 9/11, 102 minutes taught me a ton, so that is saying something. Dwyer and Flynn organized the information through the minutes in each tower. Even though a lot, and I mean a lot, is happening in such a short span of time, the authors did a great job at integrating all the information, the voice messages, phone conversations, recordings of police and firefighter communications. Also, there's a ton of names in which I immediately got confused. The names mattered in so many ways, though. I didn't care that my brain couldn't keep them straight, for the names are so incredibly important. While I knew that there was chaos and a lack of understanding about what was happening and how to proceed, I had no idea it was as bad as it was. Dwyer and Flynn show side by side how one call to the police would tell them to evacuate, and then how another police officer would tell them to stay put. The life and death of those inside the buildings below the impact zones of the airplanes of both towers were really at the mercy of whoever they talked to, an authority figure that told them to stay or go. I just panicked as I read these encounters. Security guards in the South Tower even told people to go back to work, that the problem was contained in the North Tower. Dwyer and Flynn also present the towers as their own set of problems, and they do this well. I have been to New York City, and although I loved visiting, I would never in a million years want to live there. I need grass and squirrels and quiet, and New York City is just all concrete and gray. You can't even see the sky unless you look straight up. And while I was in New York, I visited the 9/11 Museum and was amazed at how much was kept, pieces of singed paper and stuff like that. Incredible. So for a Midwestern girl who has never lived or worked in a high-rise building, the authors did a magnificent job at showcasing problems at only such tall building space. If you are on the 70th floor, it could take you a half an hour or more to exit the building. Dwyer and Flynn also described the staircases and elevators and the use of express elevators. Even though such information was scattered or briefly mentioned in other books, 102 minutes zeroes in on the particular challenges those inside the towers faced. Also, total evacuation of high-rises is not standard procedure. Such evacuations would cause more problems in the long run. I do wonder what skyscrapers do during a tornado warning, though. But that's me thinking with my Midwestern brain. But for fires, only the floors impacted as well as the surrounding floors are evacuated. Within the unfolding 102 minutes, Dwyer and Flynn write about the construction of the towers, the arguments that took place over fireproofing and staircases, which would take up precious rentable space. This at times gets a bit repetitive, and I felt it could have been handled and integrated differently into the story. However, it was crucial to what unfolded inside the towers during the terrorist attacks. Many times, the authors draw comparisons to the Titanic, how the towers were bragged about being able to withstand an airplane crash. Everyone assumed that they had plenty of time for rescues, that they had at least a 4-hour cushion of time before they needed to panic. The South Tower didn't even last an hour. There was no sense of urgency, which I find unbelievable. Even the people in the building, it's just, oh, they're going to just exit the building. Even when people realized a commercial airplane flew into the North Tower, there was still not much panic, although many in the North Tower had no idea what was happening. 102 minutes also clears up confusing aspects that other books either make even more confusing or don't even mention. The first thing is that, yes, people knew the towers were about to collapse. More than one building expert saw the damage and reported it up the chain of command as best they could. They knew the towers would not last long. A police helicopter also radioed that the North Tower would collapse. He could see from his vantage point in the sky. Dwyer and Flynn even discuss photos that have been examined after the fact, and apparently you can see all the metal melting and oozing out the windows. Another point 102 Minute discusses is the roof rescues. They tried, but there was too much smoke and it was too dangerous. Not that it would have mattered because both towers' roof access was locked and those with the keys couldn't get there. Whatever electronic setup the towers had failed, so all those who were above the impact zone died. The use of the helicopters was also a big fat failure. Firefighters are supposed to ride in the police helicopters so they can radio down to those on the ground how to proceed. No firefighter rode in any helicopter. And the helicopters were yet another point of contention between the firefighters and police, thanks to what happened in 1993. The bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993 factored into how things were done on September 11th. I will let you read all about that yourself, but I didn't realize that what happened almost a decade before played such a huge part. Even workers opted to stay in the towers on September 11th because their companies had docked them pay when they left after it was bombed in 1993. The rooftop rescues the police did that night in 1993 made the firefighters mad, who said it was just showboating. I learned so much from this book. It was most heartbreaking to read about those trapped on the upper floors, how much the smoke had taken over their floors, and their only option was to jump. 102 Minutes is the best book I've read that captures what those people went through and why they would have had no other option than to jump, based on other recordings from home from the families. It was also heartbreaking to read about those that many survivors spoke of, the ones who were injured or in wheelchairs, who were awaiting the firefighters' assistance, a rescue that never happened. Many never made it out of the building. Dwyer and Flynn also described the new radios that no one used, the lack of communication on all parts, how no one knew that one staircase was still passable. You wonder how many more could have survived had it not been for all these mishaps. The what ifs and butterfly effect in 102 Minutes just makes you think throughout the book. Another thing I learned was the exit from the building. First off, in every book I've read, the calmness of all those slowly going down the steps floor after floor, sometimes taking over 30 minutes, how no one freaked out. I can't imagine it, especially when you're ultimately trapped in a staircase. I commend those hundreds of people who didn't panic. I thought they just went out the doors opposite the side the plane had flown into. Between the debris and even those who were jumping out the windows, it was too dangerous. So they went down to the mall, then through the hotel. Workers at the hotel and police formed like a human hallway as all those evacuating walked through the main lobby. Dwyer and Flynn do a beautiful job describing such small moments that other books fail to mention. Another moment Dwyer and Flynn capture is the express elevator floor on the South Tower. Many people were waiting for those elevators when the second plane hit. I'm surprised more survivors didn't write their own accounts of what happened. Maybe in 2001, we still had some things private, whereas nowadays everyone describes everything on social media. The most shocking part was towards the end regarding the firefighters. And this I must read to you because it was kind of shocking and it surprised me. Speed does not, however, explain everything. A cascade of lapsed communications, much like the undelivered Cheney shoot-down order, cost lives. The police helicopters reported the deterioration of the two towers and specifically predicted the collapse of the North Tower. The fire commanders had no link to those helicopters or reports, but for that matter, they had few or no links to their own troops. The interagency radios were sitting on shelves and in the trunks of cars unused. It is likely that as many as 200 firefighters were inside the North Tower when it collapsed. Most of them had been in striking distance of safety when the south building fell. This gave them 29 minutes to go down no more than 30 or 40 flights of stairs, and many people did, including 89-year-old Mo Lipson, who was walking down from his office on 88 and had reached the 27th floor when the south tower fell. Few of the people inside the North Tower, even those who had heard the evacuation orders, knew that the other building had collapsed. Virtually none of them, apart from some police officers and those they encountered, realized that helicopter pilots were predicting the imminent failure of the one they were in. For no good reason, firefighters were cut off from critical information. This was as much a matter of long and bad habit as it was of the extreme circumstances. At a hearing in the spring of 2004 on the emergency response, Giuliani spoke with great passion about the firefighters who did not leave the North Tower. The reality is that they saved more lives than I think anyone had any right to expect that any human beings would be able to do. Done differently with different people, and people maybe unwilling to be as bold as they were, you would have had much more serious loss of life. Moreover, Giuliani said that the firefighters had indeed heard the warning that it was time to leave, but asserted that they had interpreted the evacuation order to mean that they should make sure the civilians got out, rather than giving us a story of uniformed men fleeing while civilians were left behind, which would have been devastating to the morale of this country, rather than an Andrea Doria, if you might remember that. They gave us an example of very, very brave men and women in uniform who stand their ground to protect civilians, Giuliani said. Instead of what we got, a story of heroism, and we got a story of pride, and we got a story of support that helped get us through. If history is to be a tool for the living, it must be unflinchingly candid. The full chronicles of D-Day and World War II note that a number of landing boats opened in deep water, sending troops to drown, a fact of vital importance to those who would someday follow the D-Day soldiers onto another beach. The evidence shows conclusively that in the critical final minutes of the North Tower, firefighters were indeed helping civilians, but that involved no more than a fraction of the rescuers. There could be no doubt that the firefighters' purpose in going into the building was to help, and that a number, like Captain Burke, stayed behind even when the future took its fearsome shape. Even so, there is substantial reason to discount the assertion that specific duties, rather than widespread ignorance of the peril, kept the bulk of those 200 firefighters inside during the time they might have escaped. I read a memoir about the firefighters during 9/11, which never said anything about this. The people in the buildings helped each other. The firefighters were 70 floors below and a long ways away. Yet I remember how everyone praised the firefighters afterward, hearing less about all those who were saved thanks to complete strangers who also worked in the building. Dwyer and Flynn were incredibly thorough with their research and that confusion with the firefighters and everything. And also they give them credit for rescues. It's just not as widespread as we believe. And then in 102 minutes, they also include diagrams that are incredibly fascinating and informative, like this one, that help the reader kind of understand how the building itself posed its own problems. It also includes pictures of both survivors and victims. I had to keep reminding myself that the book was published just 4 years after it happened, yet it reveals more than some books that were written another 10 years later. 2,749 people died at the World Trade Center on September 11th. More than 1,500 of those survived the initial crash and were trapped on floors above the impact zone. Over 1,500 people had no way to get out. Even in areas that weren't overrun with smoke, they had a total of 102 minutes to be rescued before the towers fell. 102 Minutes was my favorite 9/11 book that I've read for its information, for its style, for how much I learned all these years later. I would highly recommend it. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.